guys are, but if you would introduce yourselves the first time you speak, say I'm on the yes side, and we'll have lots of questions. We'll also encourage the yes and no sides to interact with each other. So if your opponents say something you disagree with, we'd love to have you respond civilly, no talking over other people. Be nice. All right, Brian, let's get started. Please, proponents, please introduce yourselves and the measure and tell us why you're bringing this and why it's a good idea.
Why don't you say your name first?
Sure. Robin Yee with the Yes on Measure 116 campaign.
And I'm Allie Maeda, also with the Yes on 116 campaign, and I'll just give you a little background about it. Measure 116 will put voters in charge of setting salaries for elected officials in our state. Elected officials are accountable to the voters. We hire and fire them with our vote. And creating the People's Independent Commission with Measure 116 will give Oregonians another accountability tool. Right now, politicians are actually allowed to set their own salaries. That's the status quo. It's an obvious conflict of interest. And what it's meant is that it's nearly impossible for working class folks to serve in the legislature. So a yes vote on 116 will enshrine in the Constitution that Oregonians ourselves should be in charge of setting elected official salaries. 22 other states have independent commissions that set compensation. And if voters pass Measure 116, there will be a robust public process in the 2025 legislature to set the best practices and the rules for that commission. The commission's first decisions would take effect in 2027. So this fall, it's up to the people to decide, and that's because the Oregon legislature referred the measure to the ballot in an overwhelmingly bipartisan vote. We're here on behalf of almost 30 organizations that support Measure 116 because it will strengthen democracy. Those organizations include the SEIU, the AFL-CIO, teachers, nurses, small business owners, the Latino Network, the Urban League of Portland, Family Forward Action, the Rural Organizing Project, and if you open the voters pamphlet, the Taxpayers Association of Oregon has also written in favor of the measure. So people all across the political spectrum support Measure 116 because it will increase accountability and transparency in our government. And at the end of the day, it's really about fairness and making sure that everyone has a seat at the table.
So what is the problem that we're trying to solve here?
So this is a long-standing problem in Oregon, and that's that legislative salaries are such that it's very difficult for people who have families or normal jobs to run and serve in the legislature. So I'm a mom, I have a 6-year-old. And I first became aware of this issue in 2022 when 3 Oregon legislators, women, moms, regular people, stepped down from their roles. So these are dedicated public servants who worked hard to run for office, win elected office, and then represent their communities. They all stepped down, and to a person, they said it was because they couldn't support their families. And so that concerns me very much because I think our democracy works best when it's representative, when everyone can serve, when everyone can have a voice at the table. We make better decisions.
So, but we're here to talk about not only legislators, but statewide officials and judges.
That's right.
My perception is that there is a long line of people who'd like to become judges at today's salary. There's a long line of people who run for statewide office. So yes, 3 people did resign from the legislature, and yes, $35,000 a year is not a salary that most people can afford to work for. So why are we talking about these other offices if the problem is the legislature?
Oregon ranks very low across the board for those salaries. So I think we're 49th in the nation for judicial salaries. That creates an imbalance in the judicial system when the judge is the lowest paid person at the table, which is possible now. We also rank very low for the governor, secretary of state, attorney general salaries.
Okay.
I'll just add,
Sure.
Measure 116, right, is any elected official that draws their salary from the state of Oregon, right? This measure affects them because we're trying to remove conflicts of interest, trying to remove the politics from all of these political positions that get elected. So that was the thinking behind the referral of including all of these branches and positions.
So that would include district attorneys who nominally represent counties but are paid by the state.
Correct, yeah, that's a court, but that's.
So
part
was
of
this
it.
addressed, currently there's a large imbalance in the district attorney salaries. Multnomah County District Attorney makes a lot more than the Wheeler County District Attorney. Is this going to address that, or would that be a rulemaking part of, if this were to pass?
That'll be up to the independent commission. So we can't hypothesize about the workings of a commission that hasn't been seated or
Sure.
taken effect yet.
Okay. Why is this constitutional rather than statutory?
A constitutional amendment is a chance for voters to set the direction. And so the legislature referred this to the people, again, in an overwhelmingly bipartisan vote, because they thought that the people should decide. And I think that's appropriate because we're talking about accountability here. We're talking about giving everyday Oregonians a greater stake in these decisions.
And the constitutional part is what gives that true independence, because it will be, a co-equal power that can actually set the pay without political interference. So that's a part of it to make it constitutional.
How much money has your campaign raised so far?
The yes on Measure 116 so far, roughly 150,000.
And how much do you expect to raise?
We hope to raise like 250,000 just to be able to communicate with voters, since publications are trying their best to inform voters of the ballot, and that's the same task we're trying to do.
Okay, great. Great, thank you. The no side.
Dan Meek, public interest attorney, and I can tell you that when I'm in court, the judge is not the lowest paid attorney in the room. I think that Measure 116, the proponents say that it would put voters in charge and bring accountability, but I think it does the opposite. The commission can set salaries without any role for the legislature or courts or voters, and it's actually just about unique in America in doing that. Only California of other states has this system, and even there are no raises are allowed if the government's budget is in deficit, and the salaries must be comparable to the private sector. Those safeguards are not in Measure 116. The legislatures directly set salaries in 34 states. In 11 states that do have commissions, the legislature can approve or disapprove commission-set salaries, so there is direct accountability. Commission-set salaries must be approved directly by voters in Arizona and Nebraska. In Washington, commission-set salaries are subject to voter referendum, which they would not be with this measure. And in Arkansas, commission-set salaries are limited to a 15% increase. Montana uses just a mathematical survey of 5 surrounding states.
Can I slow you down for a second here?
Sure.
So, do you agree with with the other side that there is a problem?
I agree that there's a problem, but not the one they've identified.
So what do you think the problem is?
I think the problem is that the salaries of executive branch officials are unusually low compared to other states. As far as judges go, the data indicates that Oregon is 39th when it comes to Supreme Court justices, 29th when it comes to intermediate appellate court justices, and 33rd on general trial courts. So it's not too far out of line. It's more out of line for executive branch officials. It's not really out of line for the legislature. Even if you look at all legislatures, Oregon salaries, even if you don't include the $157 per day in per diem, is the 22nd highest in the country. And if you include the per diem, it's probably around the 18th highest in the country, and it is among the highest in the country for what are called hybrid non-full-time legislatures. So, I think the executive salaries should be raised, but they should be raised by the legislature, because the legislature is accountable to voters.
So you spend a lot of time in Salem and on legislative matters. Do you think the legislature is representative of Oregonians in an economic sense?
I don't know. I don't know the economic background of legislators.
You know who many of them are.
I know who they are, but I don't know their economic circumstances. I can't tell from the way they dress.
Yeah.
So I really don't know.
Okay.
So this would be a unique thing. Under this measure, the commission can set salaries also without any role for judicial review, no matter how high the salaries are. The ballot title states, "Determinations of the Commission would not be subject to review or modification by the Legislative Assembly, the Governor, or any other official." So the Commission could raise salaries to an unlimited extent, and there's no way to nullify them apart from the people starting an initiative, getting 160,000 valid signatures, and repealing the constitutional amendment. The Commission is not limited. This Commission is not limited to setting salaries comparable to those in the private sector, which is a safeguard that is in many of the state laws and constitutional provisions. What is, I guess, irksome to me is the fact that the legislature gets to determine the appointment process, and including choosing the members of the Commission itself, so it's not independent. The exclusions in the amendment are very limited. It's only a current officer or employee of the state of Oregon, an individual who has to register as a state-level lobbyist, or an immediate family member of the above.
How many people are on the commission?
Don't know.
Do you guys know?
It's not specified in the ballot measure.
Is the requirement that it be bipartisan or in some way diverse
No.
specified in the ballot measure?
It's not specified in the text of the ballot measure, but looking at legislative intent from many sessions past, and the conversations around it, the accountability provided by the coalition that's working on it, spelled like the intent is clear, but in the measure text it is quite limited for a constitutional amendment.
Well, it's hard to say what the legislative intent is, because this was the last resolution introduced in the 2023 legislature. It had a public hearing where one person showed up. So I don't know what the intent is, and I don't think anyone can say what the legislature would do. We know what other states have done. They exclude, and what should be excluded, this measure would allow former state officers or employees, former lobbyists at the state level, current local government officers or employees or lobbyists to serve, current federal government officers or employees or lobbyists to serve, political party officers can be on the commission, campaign consultants can be on the work commission, and big campaign donors can be on the commission. Now, it also only excludes what are called immediate family members of like officers or employees of the state of Oregon, etc., but doesn't define immediate family member. Webster defines it as a person's parents, brothers and sisters, husband or wife, and children. So that would mean brothers-in-law, aunts, uncles, nephews, nieces, cousins, and even persons who live in the same household as current state officers or employees could be appointed to the commission.
So what are you worried about here? What could go wrong?
What could go wrong is we have a commission that is not restricted by any standards, any objective standards for what the salary should be. It is appointed in whatever the legislature decides how to appoint them. That's how they're appointed, with the exception of those three very narrow exclusions. And they could raise salaries to an extreme degree, and there's no accountability.
Could I interject?
Sure.
So I want to first take on the idea that this came out of nowhere. So this has been a long-standing problem in Oregon that the community-based organizations that support Measure 116 have tried to address in various ways. So it's true that the referral was introduced in June, but you can look at the legislative history on this subject and see, for instance, in 2022, the legislature took up SB 1566. Many of the organizations, again, who support Measure 116 were part of that process, bringing their ideas. The legislature was considering how to address compensation in that process. The other thing I want to address is it's true that the measure only says so much. A constitutional amendment is for voters to set the direction. And I actually think it would be problematic if every time we amended the Constitution, we added 25 pages of public policy to it. And so that's the reason why there's a robust public process after a ballot measure passes for the legislature to implement it. And that's a place where the 30+ organizations who support the measure can bring their ideas for how to implement it. Dan can bring his ideas for how to implement it. And we can have these conversations about how do we define who's eligible, how do we make sure that this is truly independent in that forum.
That's a nice idea, but there's no assurance that happens. And other states have put safeguards into their constitutions themselves. For example, some of them require hearings for the Salary Commission, and require the decisions to be made on the basis of evidence presented in the public hearings and not on the basis of ex parte contacts. But this measure doesn't have any of those safeguards, so it's up to whatever the legislature decides to do. One other thing I would like to point out that I think that I object to the ballot title, really. The legislature, instead of using the usual process for ballot titles, and the Attorney General writes a draft, people comment, it can go to the Supreme Court, etc. The legislature wrote its own ballot title and its own explanatory statement. And in those, many times it uses the favorable term independent. This is an independent commission, when in fact it's not independent. The legislature decides how it's appointed, who's on it, how it operates. Now, in comparison, I'm representing the chief petitioners on IP 14 for this past, the 2024 cycle, which is the real independent redistricting commission measure. And when we went through the ballot title process, we asked the Attorney General to put the term independent commission into the ballot title. The Attorney General refused because she said, independent conveys little, if any, information to voters, but may evoke an emotionally charged response. In other words, it's too prejudicially favorable to include the term independent in the ballot title. So we didn't get independent, even though our commission is truly independent. We asked in the Supreme Court to put in the word independent, and they said, we agree with the Attorney General, the word independent is likely to confuse voters. So the Independent Redistricting Commission measure was truly independent. The way those commissioners would be appointed is that anyone can apply, any Oregon resident can apply for it. Those applications are vetted for the exclusions, and we had a long list of exclusions, mainly the ones that I referred to earlier of employees, lobbyists,
Oh, sorry, that happens. Motion second.
even appreciable campaign contributors, and anyone in their extended families or in their households. And former and current and former of all of those folks was in the redistricting commission measure. And so it was independent. We didn't get to use the word, but now the legislature appropriates the word for itself in a commission that's not independent. And that's about it.
Okay, you guys want to respond?
Yeah, I just want to, we'll concede that this measure that the legislator overwhelmingly bipartisanly referred is not the exact measure that Dan has written for that IP. But I also want to correct that the legislative referrals went through the same processes in terms of checks and balances with the Attorney General. It was actually appealed. The original ballot title was appealed and modified after a community group sued in the process. They always open it. Just because it's referred by the legislature doesn't mean it's not subject to the same vetting process. It was absolutely. The legislature gets to write a legislative argument in favor. That's common practice on anything that they refer to the measure. And yeah, the point about SJR 34 being drafted in June, again, there was an 8-week walkout that pushed all business, and in that session, in the 23 session alone, there was another bill that really talked about this concept, SB 786. So you can refer to those records, put no emphasis on the fact that SJR 34, it was a constitutional referral. They have to make it they have to bring about that bill, that mechanism. So that's why it was brought. So I just want to say.
I just want to hear your response to that, because you're shaking your head. You said.
Yeah, the legislature wrote its own ballot title and its own explanatory statement. The Attorney General was not part of the process.
So there seems to be a factual disagreement here. So what are you talking about?
Right. So if an initiative petition qualifies it, they write the caption because that's what they're proposing. So the legislature referred this. But I'm saying that there was a referral process. It was actually appealed and modified, the ballot title and the explanatory statement in this process.
Where was it appealed? Marion County Court or?
Supreme Court.
Yeah.
The legislature wrote its own ballot title. That ballot title could be appealed to the Supreme Court.
That's my point, yeah.
But the legislature wrote it and included the word independent, and no one challenged the word independent in either the ballot title. They also wrote the explanatory statement, which repeatedly uses the term independent. And the only legal challenge that is allowed in Oregon to explanatory statements are procedural irregularities. So you can't challenge the substance of an explanatory statement. And that also goes in the voter's pamphlet. And what's important is what goes, of course, on the ballot. That's the only thing 90% of voters will see about a measure is the caption on the ballot, the 15-word caption. On this 15-word caption says creates independent commission.
Okay, I want to come back to what you raised as an issue that got you involved. So yes, we did see those 3 lawmakers leave, and they said it was because of their salary. But again, I mean, when you look at the governor's appointment process for the judiciary, there are lawyers lined up to take a pay cut. And when you look at statewide office, those positions are even at the salary levels that we have today, highly coveted. So why are we, I guess I don't understand why we're working on, why are we changing the judicial salaries that Dan has pointed out are in the middle of the pack, and Oregon is a middle of the pack kind of state. So why is this measure so broad?
Well, as Robin said, community groups have been advocating for this solution for a long time, and the salaries
if
that are...
there's not a problem, why are they advocating for a solution specifically with judicial and statewide?
Those salaries are actually quite low, and it's not that there's not people lined up, but which people, right? Which people can afford to take a pay cut to serve in the legislature, to become a judge? It's probably not people who are low income. It's probably not people like me who have a young child at home. So there is a representation problem there. I also, Dan's brought up independence, and I want to speak to accountability, because that's also a value that the 30 organizations backing Measure 116 share. Our current system, where legislators set their own salaries, is not a model for accountability. It's the status quo. It's not a system anyone would design if they wanted to create a fair government. We also have in Oregon many appointed commissions that oversee state spending, that set policy, that make important decisions. We have a Building Codes Commission. We have the Infrastructure Finance Authority Commission. So this commission created by Measure 116 would be just as accountable as any other in Oregon, subject to all relevant Oregon laws. And the final point I want to make there is that oftentimes we see in government processes that community input is an afterthought. So public input happens after the decisions are made, or it's advisory only. I think that's a real problem, and I think it's a good thing that this commission will be written into the Constitution so that it can be truly independent and have the power to implement the decisions that it makes.
Right, and I just want to lift up the real problem here is that politicians should be removed from the equation about pay, about this relationship between elected officials and the constituents they serve when they draw salary from the state treasury, from taxpayers, right? So, in the future commission's wisdom, once Measure 116 passes, if they view that there isn't a problem for judicial pay, right, they can come to that determination with the rich data that exists, with all these factors that they can consider, right, comparing to other states. Like, that's going to be a robust conversation that will happen every 2 years. It'll be a more public process. And the problem that this Measure 116 ultimately is trying to solve is to remove lawmakers from setting their own pay and those of other elected officials. Removing that equation removes the politics from it, and then decisions about about accountability, about transparency, about having a stronger democracy, that rests in the independent commission by the people.
So it's a little puzzling. I'll get to you just one sec, Dan. So normally when we worry about a conflict of interest, as in the case of lawmakers setting their own pay, we worry that they're going to set it too high. We haven't really seen that. I mean, they have repeatedly kind of talked about raising salaries, but the politics, the optics of it have prevented that from happening. So it feels like we're saying, let's save these people from themselves in a way, because they're not, the normal worry is people might be corrupt and might give themselves too much. So it's a little bit puzzling, and so I'd like you to...
Sure. I mean, I think this is the only type of profession that sets their own pay in such a public way. I think if there is optics and politics involved, I think this moves towards a place where the people can decide that when we look at what's fit for Oregon now and into the future, that decision is at the heart, or those factors at the heart of the decision, not a political football that could be used and battered about. I just think this is a stronger practice. Yeah. We see it in other states, and I think Oregon can move this way with the yes vote.
Did you poll this measure?
Yes, we've done public opinion.
What was the polling say?
That voters overwhelmingly really are receptive to the message when we remove lawmakers from this equation, and they are no longer a part of this pay question.
But in effect, this will make the outcome, likely outcome of this process is a pay increase for people, right?
Perhaps.
That's very possible. Just because the problem hasn't played out in the worst possible way doesn't mean it's not a problem.
No,
right?
I know. I'm saying that when we oftentimes, because we spend as reporters a lot of time thinking about and writing about conflicts of interest, the outcome here is different. Normally, a conflict of interest is some expenditure happens that wouldn't happen. Here, the expenditure is not happening. So are you saying that the public wants to pay politicians more?
What we're saying is that a majority of people want to see an independent commission make those decisions because they recognize that it just doesn't make sense the way it is set up right now.
Okay, Dan?
Yeah, Ali says there are other commissions. That's true, but every single one of them can be overridden by the legislature, and every single one of them is subject to judicial review, and neither one of those things would be true of this commission. This commission can decide whatever it wants, and there's nothing voters can do except repeal the constitutional amendment.
So let's say that the commission is formed and it raises salaries to a level that some individual or group thinks is inappropriate. Are you saying there's no right of judicial review? They can't say, hey, we're paying the governor $500,000, that's too much, I'm going to sue to block that?
Yes, there's no judicial review as indicated in the text of the measure. The text of the measure says, determinations of the commission, this is the ballot title, determinations of the commission would not be subject to review or modification by the legislative assembly, the governor, or any other official. And if you read the text of the measure, it basically says...
Take that to include the courts?
Yes, the text of the measure indicates that the determinations by the commission are final. And even if there was judicial review, there are no standards to apply. I mean, what other states have the standards, it has to be comparable to the private sector. Here, there are no standards to apply, so there would be nothing to review.
Do you guys agree with that?
There are no standards written into the ballot measure because the ballot measure has not passed and been implemented yet. So that would be the appropriate place to add standards. We've talked quite a bit about what implementation will look like. So I'll let Robin speak to that.
Yeah, so, right, I mean, I think the Yes campaign and Dan all really see the importance of implementation, right? Statutory implementation that provides guardrails and really, guides the commission into what it should consider in all these best practices that we see in other states, these practices that Dan has compiled and should bring forward during that public process. So we know that when it passes this November, the first round of decisions will go into effect for the 27 to 29 fiscal budget for the state. And so 2025 and 2026 are 2 years of implementation and time for the commission to do its public work.
Comment?
Yeah, please.
It's, well, the supporters say that it's, we'll just have the next legislature decide all of these things and have a public process, and that these standards and processes should be up to the legislature. But isn't it supposed to be independent of the legislature? I mean, that's how it's being portrayed in the ballot title and everywhere else, independent commission. But now they're saying it's really not independent. It'll be whatever the legislature says it is. So in fact, it's not independent. It's whatever the legislature says it is, and we don't know what the legislature will say it is. I would say that this almost creates a fourth branch of government because it's not accountable to any other branch of government. There aren't any checks and balances. As you pointed out, currently voters can hold legislators responsible for what they do. If the legislature sets the salary for someone or themselves too high, voters can object to that and not vote for them in the next election. So it seems that what this measure does is it saves legislators from accountability to voters, because the commission, I think we would all expect the commission to raise salaries. And once they do so, and voters say, "Oh, I object to doubling the salary of the legislators and the executive officers and the judges," legislators can say, "Well, we didn't do it.
Yeah.
We didn't do it.
Yeah.
It was this commission over here."
So I know you've said a number of times that there would be a process around creating rules and so forth, but do you envision that this commission will have paid staff, and how's that going to work? Because when I think about the Oregon Transportation Commission or the Environmental Quality Commission, which have very large policy setting roles, they're attached to an existing agency. So
Correct.
this wouldn't be attached to any existing agency, would it?
It could very well be.
Yeah, the best analysis so far of what, so the Secretary of State with office with each ballot measure does a fiscal analysis. They completed one,
Yeah.
happy to share it with you. They estimated that over biennium it would be fully staffed. There would be public meetings, so all the, resources given to commissions to do, public outreach and have hybrid meetings would be staffed. I'm not quite sure if they've determined where it will be located, but it will be a very visible, ongoing, it's happening in between every 2 years and throughout the time.
What, is there an analog that you would suggest that it would look somewhat like X existing board or commission, or is there no analog?
There was I don't know the full details of this, but there was a recent commission that was looking at equal pay in state government for state employees. That could provide a model, since it's similarly kind of looking at public positions that are paid with public taxpayer dollars. That could be a model that was fairly recent. I think we could look towards other states. So the most recent one being in 2016, Minnesota passed their legislative salary council with an overwhelming vote by the people. 76% supported it, and by all accounts, it's been functioning well in their state. So statutes and implementation will happen. Things like, tagging it to an index or making sure that there is more review by other officials or other bodies could absolutely be written. It should be written, and we've seen it happen in other states, and their democracies didn't fall apart. Their legislators didn't start making $500,000.
Right.
So I think when we look at the reality, I think it's going to be a solid process.
So if I think about now, we know what everybody gets paid now, and we can determine, it looks like Dan has already done that work, what everybody else gets paid around the country. So you could see a situation where you create this commission, it trues everybody up to where the commission wants Oregon to be relative to other, sorry about that.
Increasing in.
Yeah, frequency.
Saving energy.
Maybe God doesn't want salaries to go up.
We're advocating for light shed on this issue. Yeah.
My question is, what's this commission going to do the rest of the time? It feels like it's a one-time fix, and then you index, like we already index judges' salaries, right? Or we have
They're like locked
indexed
in statute.
We have indexed other people's. Yeah, but they and legislative salaries already go up, right? So I mean, they're not the same as they were 2 years ago or 4 years ago. So what's this commission going to do the rest of the time? It feels like a great job. You set it once and then you go on vacation.
Well, they're volunteers, so they would be taking time out of their regular lives to serve.
But
on
we're
this
going to pay
commission.
staff.
Yep, some paid staff
but
who
what
might
are
be cited at another agency, and
Okay.
this is part of
Yeah.
their work.
Okay.
Right.
Totally.
So
Okay. I confess I haven't read the committee's assessment of how many paid staff we need. How many do they think we need?
the total fiscal impact is negligible. I think it's quite small. I can get the number for you if you'd like.
I can look it up, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Dan, you want to say something?
Yeah, we don't know that the commissioners are volunteers. The only thing in the measure about how the commission would be structured or operate is one sentence. It says the Independent Public Service Compensation Commission is to be established in the manner provided by law. So we don't know how many commissioners, we don't know how they're appointed, we don't know if they're paid or not, etc. Robin mentioned Minnesota. Minnesota actually has two different salary commissions. One commission addresses the salaries of executive branch officials and the judiciary. That's an advisory commission only. It provides advice to the legislature, and the legislature can either approve or reject the advice. So that's not like this. However, in Minnesota also has a commission to set legislative salaries, and it does set legislative salaries. And it is, those salaries are final and they're not subject to change by the legislature.
Okay, so would you be in favor of a measure that, is there any version of this measure that you would support?
Yes.
What would that look like?
It would have the process for selecting a truly independent commission out of Initiative Petition 14. That process, both in terms of the folks who cannot serve on the commission because of potential conflicts of interest.
You'd like that to be a broader exclusion?
Much broader exclusions.
Okay.
Also, the process for selecting the commissioners should involve randomness. And for example, the Washington Commission, half of the Washington Commission is selected at random from voters. So it's not up to the legislature to develop a process to appoint people who are beholden to the legislature to the commission. So it's kind of mutual back scratching prospect. So if you had a truly independent commission, if you had standards for what the salary should look like, should they be comparable to the private sector? That's not a great standard because the private sector salaries can be out of line as well. For example, let's say that the commission decided that the comparable responsibility in the private sector would be the CEO of a relatively small electric utility. Well, here in Portland, we have one of those, and it pays the CEO $5.5 million. So maybe that would be an appropriate salary for governors. That's not a great standard. There should be some other standards, like comparable pay in other states, like Montana uses, or something tied to the average income of the urban wage earner. So there should be some substantive standards as well. And it would be and because there are substantive standards, and the commission would be making determinations of fact that should be subject to judicial review. And I would want to have the decisions of the commission ultimately subject to rejection by the legislature, as is true in 11 of the states that do have commissions.
If we're subject to judicial review, however, we come back to the same old problem, which is the judges who are going to review it their salaries are set by the commission.
That's true, but the judges would be reviewing determinations of fact. Is this a salary comparable to the private sector? You're right. They would have somewhat of a conflict of interest, but it's better than no judicial review at all, which is what this has.
If I can, I think Dan would be an excellent person to serve on the commission, right? Like, here's someone with relevant expertise.
And I'm the last person in the world who would be appointed to it.
Okay, well, could I clarify though, because I know you introduced yourself as a public interest attorney, but you're also affiliated with the Independent Party of Oregon and the Oregon Progressive Party, and you've mentioned IP14. So can you describe which of those affiliations you're here with?
None.
You're here on behalf of yourself personally?
Independent rabble-rouser.
That's right.
Okay. And just to reiterate, Measure 116 is supported by 30 organizations across the state that represent Oregonians all across the political spectrum, right?
And I don't think anything that Dan said is mutually exclusive to what the practices that this independent commission could and would likely follow. I mean, he dug them up from other places that have these factors that they have to consider, right, in the process, and things that they have to put into the equation for what they decide. When we also look at the absence of these things in the measure text doesn't mean the hypotheticals he brings up will come to pass. When we look at Oregon's in local jurisdictions, there's also salary commissions, right? We have one in Portland, Washington County, Ashland just went through a process, right? It exists all over our state. We can look those as existing in Oregon, their processes. None of those commissions are paid. They're volunteer,
yeah.
Right? So I think there's a lot of existing precedent that's not a hypothetical that shows us like Oregonians can get this work done.
Yeah.
It's been successful. It's well received by their jurisdictions and constituents. I expect the same for Measure 116 when voters overwhelmingly pass this.
So I just want to understand, Al, I think you've been clear that economic equity is a big driver here, that there are a lot of people who are excluded from seeking these positions because they can't afford to. Is there a second, is that your strongest argument?
I think our strongest argument is about removing this obvious conflict of interest that politicians are in charge of setting their own pay. It's about fairness, right? I have a 6-year-old, she loves to trade Pokemon cards. She could tell you about fairness, and she would say that absolutely doesn't make sense.
But so again, I don't see the harm. The harm in a conflict of interest is usually people are getting something they don't deserve. We're not seeing that here. We're not seeing legislators set salaries at an exorbitant level. So where's the harm in it? I'm agreeing with you that there is an economic equity harm, but where's the harm in that conflict of interest currently?
So maybe we can move away from the terminology of conflict of interest. What I see it as, I feel that decisions about this really important relationship between elected officials and their compensation they draw from the people they serve, that decision is being heavily influenced and clouded by politics rather than maybe some of these various other inputs that should be used to determine what that relationship, that really important question around democracy and representation.
Okay, so where's the harm there? What harm is currently occurring? What's the bad outcome that we're getting because of that skewed relationship?
Yeah, I think it's, we can see that I think not everyone has a seat at the table when it talks.
I concede you've made a very compelling point on that front, but what else?
I mean,
are we getting lousy candidates? Are people who run for office currently underqualified, unqualified? I mean, how are Oregonians being hurt by this?
That it's not a representative democracy. And there's not good data actually on legislators' socioeconomic status, for instance. But you can look just with your eyes at who's in the legislature. Oftentimes they're older than your average Oregonian. They may be retired, they may be independently wealthy, or have a spouse with a very high earning job. Again, that's why we want to see more regular people from all different walks of life serving in the legislature.
Okay. Do you have a response to that?
To the point about removing a conflict of interest, I don't think the current situation is a conflict of interest. It's accountability to voters. Why is it a conflict of interest when you have to be responsible to voters if you want to raise your own salaries or if you want to raise the salaries of executive branch officials? I don't understand why that's a conflict. It would be, however, there would be a conflict of interest in appointing the commissioners because the legislature will determine how they appoint the commissioners and what they do. So this is, I think, introducing a conflict of interest rather than reducing it. And I guess that's about it.
Okay.
The local commissions. I don't know of any local commission that can make a final decision on local salaries.
Okay.
There may be some, but the ones that I've seen are advisory, and it's up to the city council to actually set the salaries.
Okay. All right. Let's wrap up. If there's something that you haven't said or something that you want to emphasize or something that you want to make sure that we understood, let's give us that. Otherwise, you guys have both been pretty clear on your thoughts. Dan, we'll let you go first. Anything you haven't shared with us?
I don't think so.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, just want to state for folks, right, Measure 116 is the question before voters, right? Do we keep the status quo where politicians are involved in setting their pay, or do we move politics and politicians out of this important question? When we pass Measure 116, we create the independent public commission that will take a look at this relationship and make a determination.
But Robin, isn't the question you're really asking, do we want to pay politicians and judges more? Because we're not going to set this commission up to pay people less, right? So isn't the real question in front of voters, should we give judges and elected officials a raise?
I think it's a process question that we're asking, and then I think I think that if we looked at publicly available data that looks at what legislators in other places and couple places are earning, that Oregon would be way behind, and that perhaps corrective action would be taken up to create more opportunities. Yeah, I think that may be that's likely the outcome based on data, based on what we've seen other states move towards. So I think that's good if Oregon puts itself in line to strengthen its democracy. I think it's long overdue. I think it's a straightforward step, and yeah, I think that's the question before voters this November.
Will paying people more yield better outcomes?
Yes, I think that.
Why?
I think we see entire HR industries that look at compensation, right? Like, this is a practice that we see in lots of places, and I think they can make a direct connection between folks who can earn a living wage and focus on the work, in this case legislating, without having to worry about other aspects that might take their time away from from governing or setting policy. That would be beneficial to Oregonians.
Is part of what we're talking about here creating a full-time professional legislator? legislature, sorry.
Oh, I don't think that's the question at hand, or at least for this measure. That could be another really interesting conversation, but I do think is that it could reflect the realities of the current job and you know, who can be a part of it or even consider themselves to represent their community, to have their voice at the table, right? I think it's beneficial to Oregonians to have perspectives of people raising kids, you know, young kids in this century, people who come from rural backgrounds, from working class backgrounds, young people, right? Those perspectives we don't see in the legislature as often or at the rate that, you know, is reflected in the people. So yeah, I think those are potential benefits that come from this, but the question at hand for Measure 116,
Yep.
do we create an independent public compensation commission and remove lawmakers from this equation?
Yeah, I disagree with your statement of the question, that is, shall we give you know, office holders a raise? I don't think that is the issue. The legislature can give office holders raises now in a way that is accountable to voters. I think the real question is, should we create a process for raising salaries that is not accountable to voters?
Okay. Great, well, thank you all very much for coming in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I never know how to turn this camera off.
I think it's just the big button.
You'd think I'd know how to do it by now.
We've got to
Which
change
one?
your motion detector lights to have a
Well, we're
longer.
usually not in this cave, we're usually out in that other room.
I wondered, I've only